Welcome to the Cancer History Project podcast. Today we have Dr. Michael Link, who is a pediatrician at Stanford, and he is also the only pediatrician, I believe, ever to have been served as ASCO President. So
Yeah.
is that
There's
correct?
there's two messages there. They didn't repeat it, so that may have be a reflection of what they thought about my presidency. But I like not to think that. I like to think that they learned something from pediatricians, and I hope that there will
Oh,
be soon another pediatric president.
well, now it's even easier. You were there when the ASCO presidency was more of a popularity contest, and
Yeah,
that was decided by, if you were a breast cancer doc, you had a better shot than a pediatrician.
that's true. Yeah, it's a much better system now in terms of making sure that they get an appropriate person to be president instead of just voting for the next breast cancer doctor. I agree.
Yeah. So we've known each other probably through most of our careers, and
Yeah, I
wouldn't you
remember
say?
you sitting in the side at the Board of Scientific Advisor meetings. I
Oh
think
yeah,
that's where I probably saw you for the first time. When neither of us were as gray as we are, but that was
yeah.
a long time ago in my career. So yes, I think that we have, and certainly I have. I'll put in a shameless plug here that I read the Cancer Letter regularly. It is, it's a terrific way of pointing out to what's going on because you are pretty well connected and certainly have your finger on the pulse of what's new, including some paper you should have read. So I think it's important, and I definitely read it. And
Well, thank you so much.
thank you for all you do as in your advocacy, reporting, and everything else that goes along with the
Well,
Cancer Letter.
thank you so much. It's actually an interesting boundary between advocacy and reporting, and I guess when you do one well or try to do one very well, then you kind of switch over into the other.
Well,
There,
I think you've done a great job in terms of you just recall them as you see them,
yeah,
and the advocacy part is sort of like if you can't figure out what's what's here, you need a CT scan. But I think that those are the kinds of things that that there's a take on the news, which is pretty helpful for us out here, not in Washington and not connected all the time, and of course now particularly these times are very challenging. Let's put it that way. So.
very well. It's interesting because pediatricians in general and pediatric oncologists have a certain insight into how to be in the world.
How to survive when the world is stacked against you? Yeah, no, I think
Yeah,
that,
but also how to do something that is so important and that is so heartbreaking. And
I think that part of the what. And as I said in my ASCO address, it's partly there's a certain optimism there's about doing this because that we have moved the needle so far in even in the time period of my career, not because of my career particularly, but in that time period, I mean, things have really changed to where, we cure the overwhelming, or let's say 80% of all kids with cancer and leukemia. When I was a fellow, it was, 40% of the kids were cured, and now it's more than 90%. And I remember in particular, Burkitt lymphoma. When I was a resident, we would see these kids, and every one of them, although they seemed to respond initially, every one of them would die of their disease. And now we cure that disease with impunity, and it's remarkable. And also remarkable is that the drugs that we use, there are very few that weren't available at the time, I was a resident. So it's really collaboration, incremental improvement in, clinical trials and having virtually every patient participate. And so it's been a good run for pediatricians. And I suspect that incremental improvement every time you do something, and knowing that you have a wide ranging impact on all the kids with cancer, that's the kind of thing that keeps us optimistic even in hard times.
I hadn't thought about this. So most of the cytotoxic drugs, those drugs that cost,
A
you
nickel.
know, $5,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all you have right now, mostly? I thought you would have all
Oh,
kinds
no,
of
no, we
other
have
drugs.
more, but I mean, but in that particular disease, and even in leukemia, of course, now we have new agents which are really gave that extra boost for that for the refract for patients who have a high risk disease. But in many of these diseases, these drugs we're still using the same ones. Now we've now added in, let's say, Hodgkin disease, brentuximab is now in the mix, and checkpoint inhibitors are in the mix and really have further changed the paradigm. If you look at Burkitt lymphoma, except for the introduction of rituximab, those drugs were all available when I was a resident, the drugs that we use. So it's
Wow.
quite remarkable and quite just shows that if you have people thinking about it and how to do things better supportive care, you can move the needle. So it's been wonderful to
Hmm.
watch this change.
Hmm. What got you into oncology and pediatric oncology? How did that happen?
Well, I'm a big believer in that there are influential people in your life that serve as role models in a way that you want to be like that person. And my brother was a major influence on my life. He's 5 years ahead of me. And he. I think there's no question that both of us, sort of thought that we were going to be physicians early on, but the fact that he did it and found it very rewarding sort of influenced me. But when he was a resident, he did pediatrics, and he sort of encouraged me to do a few rotations. And a couple of my rotations were quite remarkable in terms of I didn't know that I would really like kids that much. I mean, I didn't have children of my own at this time, and just the idea of taking kids through pretty serious illness and then coming out the other side. And something that's still true today, if it weren't for the parents, it would be a totally delightful experience taking care of these kids. But it's
Hmm.
just because they are incredibly resilient. And so his influence really permeated. I did a few rotations in Boston. I had been medical school at Stanford, and he said that would be a good idea to check out some other places, and the idea that Boston was sort of a center of where you could network. And I met some people there that there's no question that continued to influence my career. And then I did my residency there and my fellowship. And in my internship, for example, I met Harvey Cohen, who he was a pediatric oncology fellow at the time, although he had also had a PhD in biochemistry. And his style, how he took care of patients, had a lasting influence on me and really sort of sealed the deal. He and another one of my mentors, Howard Weinstein, still the smartest oncologist I know. These were people who were just so excited about what they did and committed to what they did, and showed me how you relate to patients, that I wanted to be part of that, part of them, and never regretted that decision for sure. Harvey ultimately became my department chairman at Stanford years later, but I learned a lot from mentors that I had in Boston during my residency and ultimately my fellowship. And then, of course, you have some major players that have influenced my life. Sharon Murphy, she rest in peace, very important figure in terms of how I continued what I wanted to be interested in. Um, David Nathan, of course, is a major influence, and Joe Simone. These were people who I was uh, flattered to be in their sphere of influence, and people who really took care of me, took me under their wing. And these were people that certainly influenced my career. So people who came along, and you wanted to emulate their style, emulate their how they took care of people, how they integrated basic knowledge of basic science into care. These were the things that influenced my choice of pediatric oncology, and it's certainly a choice that I've never regretted.
Yeah. What about your brother? Where is he? No.
Well, my brother unfortunately died about 4 years ago,
I'm
pancreatic
sorry.
cancer. But he was a pediatrician and pediatric nephrologist, and so no question, there were some decisions that I had to make that I might say were having lived as his younger brother my whole life, and people and my teachers in school would call me by my brother's name, and
His name is.
So he was David. So they would call me David, and I would say, "Oh, that's my brother," And so this was went all through life this way. And ironically, when I was at medical school at Stanford, far away from his reach, and I enjoyed the idea that I was my own person. And then I went back to Boston, and one of the downsides of Boston was there I was in his territory, and he had been a resident at the Mass General, and I did some rotations there. But I had a wonderful rotation as a medical student at the Children's Hospital. So I decided I was going to choose the Boston Children's Hospital, and so partly to get away from his direct influence. And so I was ready to start, and found out that just a couple months before I started my internship, he had accepted a fellowship in nephrology at Children's Hospital. So we were together again, and the page operators would confuse us all the time. So I was right back where I started, and I think that was one of the reasons I think that I didn't take a job in Boston at Dana-Farber. I actually migrated to Stanford over the objections of David Nathan, no less a person. So that was, I had to contend with that, but I had to get out from under, and I think it was a good decision for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Good place to grow up. A lot of people from Cleveland, but not a lot. I realized that if LeBron James could change the entire economic outlook of a city just by leaving or coming, I realized that probably I needed something a little more than that. It was a good place to grow up, but I'm glad to have left. And when I went to medical school, I fell in love with California, and so that was one of my reasons for returning 40 years ago.
Wow. It's been 40 years at Stanford.
Actually more. I joined the faculty in 1979, so So
that's quite a.
Yes.
Just thinking back, and when did you make the decision to go into pediatric oncology?
I think that when I was a resident, finishing my internship and starting my residency, I sort of had to sit down with a couple of my mentors who were planning my career for me, as they can only do in Boston. And they basically told me, the things that I couldn't do, and the things that were really the fields where, where the science was really the most exciting. And they were really in genetics at that time, and hematology oncology. And as I said, I had a couple of people there who just made during my rotation on the oncology service, I really fell in love with the clinical aspects of the field. And of course, at that time, there was just the beginnings of the excitement surrounding the biology and understanding more of the biology of leukemia. So it was really sort of a slam dunk. And then David Nathan, of course, planned my career for me, just telling me what I should do. So initially, I thought I was going to be a bone marrow transplanter, but ultimately sort of was influenced by the oncologist, and was happy to do pediatric oncology. So it was really that stay in Boston during my beginning of my junior residency where I was totally captivated by all aspects of it, and then that's when I really decided to enter the field.
Mm-hmm. But this is also the time of just incredible excitement in that field.
Yeah, and it's even more exciting now, obviously. But in there, this is when the biology of leukemia was being unraveled, and the idea that you could sort out risk groups of children with leukemia, and understanding that this disease, which was looked the same under the microscope, was really 15, 20, 25 different diseases on a molecular level. This was all emerging at that time, and how could you resist? I mean, it was really, you could really understand your enemy for the first time. So that was always one of the things that I've told residents too. I said, why do you be an oncologist? Said, you can actually see your enemy. You look at the microscope, and there it is. It's leukemia, or it's a Wilms tumor, or whatever. I said, show me what a lupus looks like, or under you can't even grab your enemy and sort of visualize it. So this was another one of the attractions that you could, and I love the collaboration. I mean, there's the idea of this multidisciplinary care of really working with surgeons and working with pathologists and working with radiation oncologists. I mean, it was such an attractive thing, and that was sort of that was what was emerging at that time of how we took care of patients. And, as I'm sure you know, I mean, I had some wonderful collaborators. Sarah Donaldson, my radiotherapy collaborator, wonderful mentor and colleague, and Ron Levy, who sort of introduced me to, all the immunology of, these are people who were huge figures in my life, my professional life. And so it was an easy migration into pediatric oncology for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess just having mentors like Joe Simone, who was
Yeah.
a total giant, and even in leukemia as well, and childhood disease.
Yeah, and he was just a wonderful mentor. I mean, you have to understand in the addition of to these people, they're pediatricians, which, they are warm, welcoming, helpful, and they, it was an atmosphere of, that they're your colleagues. I mean, they accepted you as a colleague. It was a wonderful feeling. And as I said, we're a relatively small community of pediatric oncologists, but we all like each other, help each other, collaborate with each other. And that's, I think, one of the wonders of the wonderful nature of the field of pediatric oncology. And I think that's been that way for a long time.
And run studies together, which is
Exactly. Oh, that's the whole thing. That the idea that as I said, I reviewed my presidential address, and that was the whole point. You couldn't do it by yourself. There was just no way you were going to have enough patients in one institution to run studies that are going to have statistical endpoints, or that's endpoints that statisticians are going to be able to sort of hang their hat on. And so you had to collaborate. And so that was one of the wonderful things about the Pediatric Oncology Group, the Children's Cancer Group, and ultimately the Children's Oncology Group, and also some of the small collaborations, 5 or 6 institutions getting together. We have our own Hodgkin consortium with St. Jude, Dana-Farber, and Stanford, and a couple other institutions, all collaborating to have enough patients to make a meaningful contribution to the field. Mm-hmm. So, yes.
And also, this was an era when there were 4 cooperative groups in pediatrics, right?
Yeah, we had there was this, at the time, with the Children's Cancer Group, the Pediatric Oncology Group, and then the Wilms tumor was a separate little group, and the Intergroup Rhabdomyosarcoma Study Group. And at the time, we had this meeting that turned to be really transformational. We were meeting, I actually was the vice chairman of the Pediatric Oncology Group and also of the Rhabdomyosarcoma Study Group. And we were sitting around and talking about studies where we had to collaborate, and Sharon Murphy just had this, she said, why are we doing this? Why don't we just merge? I mean, she said it in the only way Sharon could say it, in a very compelling, the argument was essentially irrefutable. And from then on, we just sort of merged. And, there were some bumps in the road and some regrets and some unregrets. We always felt that the competition between groups was actually healthy in some ways, because you had more than one idea going at the time. But ultimately, of course, the way things have gone, and because the cure rates are so high, and, you just there's just not enough patients in the whole galaxy and to do some of the studies that we'd like to do. So this, the unification of the groups as COG was an important and really transformational idea that she had, and I think it's changed the face of pediatric cancer.
Yeah, totally. And then also paved the way for other groups to merge and become more.
Yeah, I mean, you just need it in this day and age, where the patients are a resource that is in short supply sometimes for some of the studies that you want to do. And especially, again, back to that theme, that's the cancers that we thought are one cancer are actually multiple different subtypes that have different prognosis, different driving mutations, and that we know now. So that the groups that you're studying are getting smaller and smaller, and so international collaboration is the name of the game if you're going to get anything done. So it was Sharon had foresight. There's no question about it, and it was definitely needed. And I think it accelerated it, paved the way certainly in pediatric oncology, and showed the way for our adult colleagues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's fascinating to think about that era. And really covering it was very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How how did you how did you get involved in ASCO, and how did
Oh.
you get to presidency? How did that?
Well, that's a different story.
That's two
We,
stories. Let's
we
break
didn't
it
have to
into
we
two
didn't have to storm the
questions.
Capitol, but
Please.
I was a board member. I'm not sure really how. I suspect people like Joe Simone, um, and also Phil Pizzo, who was at that time, was a board member, and they were in the I guess in a pediatrician on the board of ASCO, and so I'm sure that behind the scenes they must have pushed my thing along because I was on the ballot and made it to the board of directors, and I had a couple of episodes where I sort of really. Uh, Advocated for pediatrics. I said, here we are, you raise a lot of money on pediatric and little bald children, but you don't do much for them. That was one of my, and they really went to bat and really did a number of things. And when I was on the board, they also, we started the Alliance for Childhood Cancer, another one of Sharon's brainchildren, where we really establish an organization of organizations, both professional advocacy, all sorts of with the theme of that they all had a stake in children with cancer. So even so, the AACR, for example, ASCO, and these are the big organizations that are part of the alliance. And this was a mechanism that was totally bankrolled and funded by ASCO for a long time to help us with our advocacy work, and so that was sort of past tense. And then I guess somewhere along the line, somebody made a decision that maybe we should have a pediatric president. And that, of course, still those years as the president of ASCO is among the highlights of my career. Of course, as you well know, it was actually an opportune moment because when I was the president-elect and the president was when the drug shortage that became a catastrophe. Really, that was really the theme, the alternate theme of my presidency. And so getting to understand the inner workings of how this all happens and the economics, and I of course met Zeke Emanuel and sort of his understanding, really understanding the economics behind these drugs, and as you say, those drugs that are $5 a vial, that are really curative, that were unavailable. And so mostly I was educated by the ASCO staff. Obviously, had a lot of interaction with some of my favorite people of ASCO when I was president. And of course, they would tell me what I was supposed to say and would wind me up and put me in front of Paul Goldberg and and the New York Times and others to say, and here's, I would say something. Occasionally, I have been known to make faux pas. For example, I was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, and I told them that the drug shortages were a consequence of unfettered capitalism. And so I was told later that probably wasn't the right audience for that particular comment, but but it's true. And
It's true.
so I
Well,
don't
yeah.
so those were that was the education that I had, and it got me very involved. I could go through sort of what I see as the stages of my own personal trajectory in my career, but that got me to understand how important advocacy was and how important understanding how things really work, and where the levers are that you could push on to try to get things done. I mean, that was a really important part of my education as president of ASCO. So that was, as I said, a highlight of my career in many ways, but certainly dealing with the political issues at that time was part of my education.
I'm just thinking about the unfettered capitalism point, because I mean, I think it's unfettered monopoly behavior by, or whatever it is. It's not. I think just capitalism proper would have probably produced the drugs.
Well, I think that here's what happened that really made me understand this is that there was one of the drug production facilities in Bedford, Ohio, which is right near where I grew up. They had whatever it is, an FDA inspection, and they had whatever it was that they were shut down.
Benvenue, right?
Benvenue, yeah. So, what happened was I began to understand it. So here you have a plant that you're going to have to put in a few $1,000,000 to sort of refurbish it or whatever. And then you can decide, do I want to make cytarabine and methotrexate at a nickel a vial where I'm losing money on every vial that I make? Or can I make, like Viagra, whatever else they want to make at that time, which is, that's obviously it's a pill, not an injectable, but just sort of as a metaphor. Or I'm going to make something where I can make a lot of money. And understanding from the point of view of a corporation, which is, owes to its stockholders, that's an economics decision, which is understandable. There isn't much incentive to make a drug that is that you lose money on in every vial, and there's especially these injectables where it's actually not so easy to put it into a vial the right way around. So I learned a lot about that. I learned from my own colleagues who had gone into industry about what this manufacturing process is all about. I learned some of what goes on in the FDA and their efforts to try to import drugs in workarounds to try to solve the problem. But ultimately, it's an economics proposition, and we're in a situation where there's no shortages of the very expensive drugs, but there's certainly shortages of drugs that are pretty cheap. And it's not only cancer drugs, of course. It's anything like even IV bags, bicarbonate, things that you would think would never go out of production, but you can't get them. You can't take care of the patients.
No, for you as a pediatric
Oh,
oncologist, this is a tragedy. This is not just, oh, like for me, I'm reporting it and I'm bored stiff reporting it. It's like watching grass grow. It
yeah.
doesn't go away. We all hate that. Yeah, okay, we'll solve the damn problem.
You would think.
Raise the prices, do
You would think.
whatever. But for
You would.
you, it's hell.
Well, for us, it got to the point where it put us in an incredible ethical bind, where we had a limited supply of a drug, and you were actually making decisions which patients should get it, and which patients, therefore, would be sort of go to the back of the line. And those are the kinds of decisions you never want to have to make. And, we had to decide, and then you had a recipe for how to cure a disease. And then you have to say, how do you modify this with the drugs that are available? So, it was horrible times. And it was, as we talked about delivery, what's the point of having done all this investigation, having a recipe or a protocol that would cure the overwhelming majority of kids with lymphoma or leukemia, and then finding out that you can't deliver the goods because something as stupid as you don't have this cheap drug available. It was terrible times. So and unfortunately it continues to rear its ugly head periodically. So
Yeah.
we haven't solved the problem.
It's not even was. I would argue that it is a terrible time, and
Yeah,
it just keeps coming back every year almost now. What's actually you one of your trainees is someone
George.
George is the first time actually I talked to him. George Stidmarsh, now chairman of Cedar, director of Cedar, is first time I talked to him was when he was making levlucovorin, right?
Yeah. So in fact, he had he taught me a lot. I mean, he was one of our trainees who went into industry, and he knew his way around the FDA for sure. And he was the one that explained to me about the manufacturing process, and that this is, these are as sort of low level stuff as this is. You'd think that this is easy to solve. Why it is so difficult to solve, and why it was so difficult to import drugs. So he solved I think it was the leucovorin and also the Doxil problem with importing. So he remember at the time had established citizens oncology. In other words, he would establish he would establish a licensed company that could produce the drugs, but he needed a lot of investment. And of course, the problem was, first of all, it was a whack-a-mole problem. This drug's in shortage now. Somebody comes into the market and makes it, and so if you're left with you got to make sure that you have somebody buying the drugs. And so there was a lot of. It's interesting. It's a lot like in a different context, the vaccine problem. In other words, how do you know how much measles and mumps vaccine you should make? And, the question is, how did they solve that? Well, they solved it at the CDC by sort of having a kind of a contract relationship with the companies that they would say, we will contract with to make X number of vials of MMR for the state of Massachusetts, and we will guarantee that there's a buyer for it. And of course, the way that was worked out is because you know exactly how many doses of MMR you need, because all you have to do is take the number of birth certificates and multiply by 3. So they knew exactly what the need was. In cancer, nobody seemed to know how much methotrexate do we need in a given year, and so it became a much more complicated problem to solve. But there were some interesting models that came up, and George, of course. I hope we have a friend at FDA now in him, a friend to pediatrics. But he educated me a lot on some of the complexities of why the problem is not so easy to solve. Let me put it that way.
Well, the problem that I know he solved or helped solve was levodopa, right, which actually was a different drug with a different payment schedule, different price, and therefore you could charge for it. And if you needed levodopa, you bought this other stuff.
Yeah, now you're way above my pay grade. So this is where I sort of talk to these people and try to understand the problem, and I rely on, and this is where, again, back to the ASCO presidency, where you're working with people who really know their way around Capitol Hill, really know their way around legislation, and people like Deb Kamen who are just they get it, and they can look at the downstream effects of things that you might propose that you think would solve the problem. And it was actually a privilege to work with these people to really, broaden my horizon of, why these problems aren't as easy to solve as I would have thought they would have been. So
I'm still kind of in that, even after many decades of covering this idiotic problem with drug shortages, I'm still kind of in the sense, I'm so incensed that I believe they can actually solve it. If they wanted to solve this problem, they would solve this problem.
You sound like me, which makes you sound like my father. That was his approach to life. He said, look, this is an easy problem. Just put three people in the room together, and you should have it solved. Don't let them out until they've solved it. I agree. I don't get it.
That's right. Yeah. What did he do?
He was a businessman, but he was very smart. And, I have to say that I miss him a lot because he cut through the chaff very quickly on some of these. He wasn't a physician, but he looked at me like some of the things I was doing. He was wonderful. I called him up once and I said I was a fellow or whatever. I got my first paper published, and, I was really excited in blood. And he said, "How much did they pay you for it?" And I said, "Actually, I had to pay $50 to get the thing reviewed." And he looked at me like I was a moron. So gives you some pride.
I mean, really, it sounds truly, it's like raise the price,
Well, as Zeke pointed out, this isn't a problem in other countries, in European countries. They don't have shortages of methotrexate. This is a United States problem predominantly. And, why is that? And, it was partly his analysis of just that the drugs are so cheap and the profit margin so thin that it's fine when everything's running smooth. But when you have a problem, a glitch, and it's going to cost you a lot of money to fix the glitch, is it really worth that investment to make a drug that you're sort of barely making a profit on at all? So I get it.
It's a very taut system, and not
much room.
Yeah, but then raise the price. I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, there's a lot of. It's been a while since I've really sort of focused on this in my career, I have to admit. But it was interesting listening to all the arguments of what the root cause of this, whether it was whether it was the manufacturers, whether it was the FDA, whether it was the these consortia that supplied hospitals. I mean, there's all kinds of theories. Some of them, subscribable to, and some of them which are totally off the wall. But conspiracy theories. But in general, it's just tragic that was the key point, that we have the cure in our hands. We have the recipe, and it's unfathomable that the problem actually, or the limiting factor, is that you can't get these cheap drugs that that are just unavailable.
Yeah, I was covering most recently the platinum drugs
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
the harrowing conversations and the rationing systems that had to
Mm-hmm.
exist.
And the idea that you could substitute. I mean, we actually wrote a paper about that. You have to have a workaround, and so you sort of put in a workaround that should work. It should work. Famous should work in oncology, and it didn't. I mean, we had in our situation, we thought when nitrogen mustard was in short supply, we thought, okay, we'll just substitute cyclophosphamide, same class. We could figure out the dose, and we demonstrated without any doubt that there was an increase in the relapse hazard with that drug substitution. So not everything that you think works, unfortunately, and that was a very, how shall I say it, a difficult lesson. And the platinum thing is just another thing. Well, I use carbo. I don't know that, there's plenty of studies that show that they're not, it's not a one-to-one substitution. So,
Yeah, it's
horrible.
like Otis's joke is he asks, "What does Otis Brawley and 5FU have in common?" And that is age. Otis was born in, you know,
That sounds like an Otis drug. Yeah.
and nitrogen mustard. My God, that is like
Well,
Joe
we were
Simone was
Oh
born
yeah, we
in.
were using it. It's no longer available, but still, I mean, the
Yeah,
idea that here we had a regimen that was perfectly good, and you'd think that, okay, so just as you did, this is a drug of historical interest only. All we have to do is substitute the most reasonable, newcomer or a drug that has the same mechanism of action, if you will, and it was a failure. So sometimes these recipes, I'm sure Julia Child would sympathize. You can't just willy-nilly substitute and expect to have it come out the same. So
absolutely. And
hard lesson
it
to learn.
must lead to just harrowing conversations. Can you remember
No,
any of those conversations? How
yeah,
do
and there
you
was
do it?
He was horrible. I mean, that was actually there was I'm trying to think of it was a publication about the ethical considerations surrounding these drug shortages, which was sort of really was where the rubber met the road. How do you decide who gets the drug, and is it? And then we have to talk about the likelihood of being cured. And so, in other words, you sort of put all your eggs in that basket of the patients that had that it really would make a difference in it to being cured, whereas patients who were less likely to be cured, not the unavailability of this drug would sort of in a very harsh way have less of an impact. That's not a kind of decision that I wanted to make, but there were some case stories about exactly those sorts of things that it was terrible.
Yeah, yeah.
Terrible.
I wish if it ever comes up again, I really want to cover it from the point of view of the parents.
Yeah. What do people do that are in the trenches, and how do you actually say this?
Yeah,
That can you believe? I mean, that's how you started. Can you believe that here we are in whatever year it is, 20, whenever the next shortage is going to come, and we don't have access to this? And of course, there's plenty of other things. That antibiotics have been in short supply. Things as basic as bicarb. There's a time you couldn't get any IV bags or
yeah.
something like that. It was just preposterous.
Saline.
Sailing, yeah, you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here we are. This is the United States of America in the 21st century, really. So.
Speaking of which, you kind of knew where the field was going, or at least you kind of had a sense of how to orient your career to make the most impact. Did you ever imagine that the war on cancer, which is
we
this is we
white
have
flag. we yeah, it's terrible. I mean, what's going on now? Of course, I can take it to even a different level. I mean, you have to understand, I'm a pediatrician, so here I am, and they have measles. I mean, really, measles in 2025? How is that possible? And I remember this brought back a funny story that when I was a medical student, we were rounding on a kid. Some kid presented with acute paralysis, and we had all these consultants telling us what this could be, immunity, blah blah blah, and we had one of these cagey old community pediatricians who rounded with us. He was our community attending, and he said, "This is polio. What is wrong with you people?" I mean, and it turned out to be a case of polio, and this was way back when I don't know why the patient had not been immunized. But to think that these things, which we haven't thought of, heard about, forgetting my role as, measles in the community is terrible for immunocompromised hosts and all that, but just to think that there are people getting a disease that we wiped out, it's unfathomable to me. And so this is basic pediatrics. It's not even pediatric oncology. But if that's the state of our country, it's
Are
regrettable.
you seeing it now? You
Um,
personally?
well, in Texas, they have cases of measles, and we've had cases of measles in California. And I haven't seen a case personally, but I worry about it. We used to be, when we would take care of our kids who were, we would tell parents, kids can go to school unless there's something going around the school. You really, because most of the infections that these kids get are from germs that are already in their body. They're not going to catch it from anybody. And then came COVID, where we had to have a totally different approach and say, gee, that if that kid in front of you in line in McDonald's has COVID, it really is a danger. And so we had to sort of revamp what we tell people. But I never thought I'd be in a position where I have to talk to people about, measles and polio and chickenpox as a threat, because they're, a threat of in measles, it's a matter of how serious your illness is going to be. And, if you're immunocompromised, it's life threatening. And so, I don't know. It's
Polio? I haven't
yeah.
seen polio yet.
No, I haven't seen it
coming.
yet. But I was going to say it's the same, it's the same thing. And there was a thing about diphtheria. There's another one that, I actually this is part of my presidential address. It was so funny to look at this, of how successful we were in eradicating diphtheria just with vaccine. And, I have the curves, and there happened to be a paper published of how prevention is so important. It's part of my ASCO Presidential address. And here we are, this is how many years, of 15 years since I've been the president of ASCO and giving that address. And we're talking about the same thing again, that that we're back where we started, or back before we started. It's hard to believe.
Well, how do you keep, as a mentor, how do you keep young people that you mentor from
Being
going
discouraged.
into driving Ubers or whatever?
Well, I hope that's not the choice. But I think that the way I got into it was just the excitement and passion of the people that were my mentors. In other words, and in every way, in caring for the patients, and they're caring, and they're advocating for them, and that was part of it. And being really smart, that was one of the things that I wanted to be like Howard Weinstein, for example. And I think that now the science is so fascinating that if you can't get excited by this stuff, if you can't get excited by the molecular underpinnings and targeted agents and multiple ways of doing it, I mean, gosh. So, I think there's a generational difference. And I think one of the things that is most discouraging is, if I were planning to go into the field and I wanted to be a translational scientist and I wanted to see what the R01 pay line was this week. I mean, why would anybody go into academic anything for that matter? And then we are losing a lot of some of our best and brightest to industry. I mean, that's for sure. But the idea that, that academics, and certainly in pediatric oncology, it's really in the academic centers where a lot of it takes place, that it's difficult to convince people to look at what's going on at the NIH and to be willing to commit to a 3-year fellowship, and then whatever it is, 4 or 5 years of junior faculty before they're independent investigators. It's kind of scary for the field.
For the field.
And
Yeah.
I'm sure this is true beyond pediatrics. I have a very narrow view because that's what I do, but it's got to be true everywhere in oncology for sure.
But you want that. That's like the most important part
Yeah,
of
the pipe.
oncology, is the pipeline into pediatrics.
And the pipeline is important for two things. Number one, of course, is because I'm going to retire. I should have retired maybe already, and you need to be replaced. But more than that is, these are the people that continue to stimulate us. In other words, having a journal club, or having a meeting where you discuss something, and having one of the your fellows or very junior faculty members say, "Hey, I read this paper that," or we just did something in the lab, this, that, and the other, which was exciting. Boy, that's what continues to make it interesting and exciting to do this. And so we need the next generation coming up to keep the field moving and keeping it exciting. And that's what worries me a lot in terms of what the current state of affairs is. besides the fact that I don't know how many of those people are going to resign their positions, and all that experience and expertise is migrating, out of Washington. So
Well, I was actually thinking about Stanford. I did forget to ask you about it. The draw of Stanford at the time. I mean, my God, there were just giants of the field
yeah,
working there every, you know,
yep.
what was it like?
Well, so I must say that part of the reason I went back to Stanford was to get away from my brother, number one, and number two, because I had fallen in love with California, and I really wanted to go back. But I realized that my opportunity and what I wanted to do when I went back there is to treat lymphoma. And of course, why that was because there was Henry Kaplan, Saul Rosenberg. I mean, sitting in lymphoma staging conference at that time. And then, of course, with Richard Hoppe, sort of an up and coming. Sarah Donaldson is sort of the radiotherapist for kids. I mean, the pediatric arm. And I wanted to be the oncology half of that dyad. It was a privilege. You just listen to, you listen to people. I mean, when Henry Kaplan talked about something, and when he looked at an x-ray, or when he gave you just a pearl would fall out there, and you realize, my gosh, you just learned something incredible from years and years of experience. And when they went through, all this meticulous staging, and how, in the day when surgical staging was, and why it happened, and you had one of the leaders in terms of lymphography, all this sort of expertise in one room. It really was a privilege. And I will say, just as an aside, one of the privileges of being the ASCO president was the same thing. You're sitting at a table with the board members of ASCO, and it was look at you have Larry Norton as your sort of next to you, sort of, and I mean, one individual after another, with phenomenal expertise, phenomenal sort of range of knowledge and sort of a perspective in a variety of different areas. Some bringing legislative and kind of those sorts of things. Other people just plain science and how to do clinical trials, all that kind of stuff. For me, it was like, wow. I had a little bit of feeling that I didn't belong there, kind of like that somebody's gonna find me out, kind of thing. But it was an amazing privilege, each of those things, to be surrounded by people like that. So
Yeah. Takes years to get over the imposter syndrome.
well, I still haven't sometimes, but yeah, it does. My wife would always encourage me. I would say, God, I was around them with all these big boys, and she said, maybe you are a big boy, but that's because she's my wife, not because it's true.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Looking at where we are right now, and I mean, this is a field that needs leadership, as much leadership as it can get, because it's getting a lot of beating from the outside. If you were to exercise leadership, what are your thoughts about where we are, and how do we get out of where we are? How do we survive?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because I look at it. So I see that the leaders of, like the leaders of ASCO, AACR, they're doing their best to stand up to some of this as best they can. I certainly admire Alan Garber. So Alan, president of Harvard, former Stanford faculty member, and actually a friend. I admire the fact that he's willing to sort of take them to court, stand up for academics, stand up for the fact that you can't take $1 billion worth of grants away from Harvard. But I'm a little bit discouraged by the fact that so many other leaders have caved to this. I mean, it tells you something that you're willing to negotiate with these things and put up with. It's very difficult. What worries me more is that this is not necessarily only a reflection of the current administration. I mean, it's a reflection of our country. Some of this anti-elitism and is obviously in there in the parts of the country that maybe we don't visit enough or don't cater to enough, but they don't want to see what the experts have to say. This came certainly in during the COVID epidemic. A lot of anti leadership or anti people trying to tell you what to do, and people kind of forget sometimes that the bodies were being stacked up in refrigerated trucks in New York before we had any kind of guidelines and before we had a vaccine. They seem to have forgotten that. You want people who actually know what they're doing to take care of you and to sort of run health policy. You ask these people if they would take their car would they take their Mercedes to a Mercedes dealership, or would they take it to the local gas station? And they would probably tell you that they really want the experts doing the work. Well, that's what we want at all these government institutions, and unfortunately they're being attacked. So I'm kind of discouraged by what's afoot in our country, but it's mostly the idea that expertise and data are kind of being replaced by narrative, and that's a very frightening
Is there a
situation.
way that we can compete on the narrative, uh,
Yeah.
like we just did? For example, I mean, you don't really have to say evidence-based medicine, for
Well,
example.
but the idea that unfortunately people get their information that data and science are not sort of the basis for how people understand the world. It's narrative, and sometimes the most compelling narrative, which may not at all be based in any data or facts, is what sort of captures the imagination of many of our voters, and that's. I don't know where is the problem, that we don't teach science appropriately, that people are not based on like what we can prove, that they're unwilling to accept things like that the sun rises in the east every day. I mean, so it's things like that are scary in terms of how do we reverse this trend. And I just don't. I mean, the trouble is that the people, I'm preaching to the choir. The people that understand this and are doing their best against it are already converted. The question is what we do about the majority of people out there who do the voting and who seem to be going along with this, data notwithstanding. So it's a discouraging time for me, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't think we would ever get to this point where we are.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's very scary, and I don't
I
know.
mean, how can you deny the efficacy? And it's when we talk about vaccines and their danger. I mean, this is one of the great contributions of pediatrics to the world, and now and any number of studies that show that there's no connection between the MMR vaccine and autism doesn't seem to convince anybody. In other words, the out there sort of outrageous sort of commentary seems to be more compelling than just plain hard-nosed data, which is, as you might say, boring.
Yeah, I wouldn't, but yeah, but yeah, I guess also looking at mRNA, that when you
Yeah.
ban that, you've just
Yeah,
and
especially since it led to the Trump's greatest triumph of the mRNA vaccine. You would think that this would be something that would be like extolled, and I mean, I don't get it. I just do not get it, and I think there's too much anti-science or ignorance of science in our country, which is you know so
there's also
people.
the science of the yeah that, but there's also the cancer in mRNA.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm just talking about that. There's been a
Yeah,
withholding of funding for mRNA vaccines. I'm talking about in general. That's what I thought you were referring
yeah,
to.
but also both,
Yeah.
right? I mean, there's idea of a tamping down the mRNA ending of
Yep.
that. It's really odd, but I don't know. I'm gonna be optimistic in spite of myself.
No. Our people are not usually optimists, but I guess you have to be. It's
No,
I mean, look, if you take the long view, I mean, people say that we've been in this kind of situation before, and I accept that, although never to this degree. I don't think, where there's been this much division and this much denial of facts, and so it's discouraging. And I'm at an age where I'm very close to retirement, and so I can say that it doesn't affect me. But I certainly worry about my children and their children. The world that they're inheriting. I mean, I want my kids to have availability of vaccines against diseases, and I want science to continue to move forward and develop new cures. And it's going to be difficult if you dismantle the NIH. I mean, for one thing, it's just and dismantle the regulatory agencies.
Yeah, but actually, I'm gonna have to start getting optimistic here, which is that Congress didn't allow that to happen.
Yeah. So I'm encouraged. It's not done deal yet, but
No.
yeah. So
It's a done deal. Enough.
enough.
Enough of
Okay.
a done deal. Oh yeah,
Okay.
there's no way that 40% cut not happening.
That for sure. But the idea that this used to be that from the way back when, that doubling the NIH budget used to be sort of everybody bought into it. It was nonpartisan, or it was by whatever you'd call it. It was like some of the Republicans were the biggest defenders of this doubling of the budget, and for all the right reasons. That it improved science, it improved the health care of Americans, and it also created jobs, for God's sake, of all the things that to use as an argument. But all the stuff that NIH funding had done, and all the companies that have spun off from university grants and developing new technologies, and to think that is not this is obvious. This is sort of a slam dunk. To think it's not a slam dunk is kind of discouraging.
Yeah. Let's get your presidential address
Okay,
and
I'll send
publish
it.
it, because that would be fun to
Yeah.
have this conversation and your address.
Well, talk about some of the same issues. Unfortunately, some of the same issues, but fortunately also. But I think that it reflects sort of where my career trajectory is, as what I think is important. Basically, still at the root of it is the pleasure of taking care of patients and taking them through an illness. So that is still what makes this career, for me and for anybody, I think, who's an oncologist, not just pediatric oncologist. That's what makes it worthwhile. But you hope you can sort of do things that move the needle also, move the needle on a disease by running a study. And more for me, it's now sort of moving the needle on advocacy, so you can sort of do something for the greater good. So my career has been sort of how shall I say, it's migrating from the pleasure of taking care of an individual to sort of doing a study that benefits a lot of people, to understanding through advocacy. That was mostly through ASCO, that if you really want to move the needle and make sure that there are drugs available, or whatever it is, make that kids have insurance, then you really have to get involved in the advocacy business. So that's where I've migrated. But I still love taking care of patients.
That's fascinating. That's excellent. Thank you for doing all of this for
That's
over
great.
40 plus years.
No, I'm flattered to be part of this project, or what that really is. That pediatrics, we sort of are the tail end of things. But when you see my ASCO Presidential address, you'll see that we think that we've been leading the way, and we've provided the model for how we should proceed. So,
And that is true. That is undeniably correct.
yeah. So as some of my mentors, the Joe Simone, David Nathans, Phil Pizos of the world, yes, they certainly would subscribe to that.